Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Tuesday, February 28th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 186 days, the game against Michigan in 270 days. A lot of times I will end these shows by talking about all the great stuff that Buckeye Huddle has to offer, and Kevin and Tony and I covering the team, and Mark and Alex on the recruiting beat, and how we've got this great team of X's and O's guys and scheme gurus, and how it's a great place to get smarter about football. And I was just thinking that when I was wrapping up one of the shows recently, I haven't had any of those guys on the show recently, so we're going to change that today. We're going to be talking to Devin Radcliffe, and if you watch any of our post-game shows, he was on pretty much all of those last year, giving you some instant analysis and breakdown after all those Ohio State wins and losses last year. Devin, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
So you tweeted something at Tony and I after we did a show on the defensive line towards the end of last week on the Buckeye Weekly podcast feed. And I'm just going to read it here, and that's going to kind of be our jumping off point for the show, because I thought it was an interesting thought, and it feels like this is sort of very much in line with what you guys do on the site. It's a little bit of insight and analysis on some things that maybe Ohio State could do differently, and then we get to ask you a lot of why questions, and that's something that comes up a lot on the board is like, okay, you say that. Why? Why is that different? Why is it? We are basically the 3-year-olds to you, the patient parent, explaining everything in very small, slow words. So this is what you get to do today. It's all your fault for tweeting this at me. So here we go. Let's start with the tweet. You said, I really would like to see the jack position more like what you see Georgia, for example, do with their flex defensive end. A 3-4 outside linebacker type, if you will, still have the ability to play odd and even front. So I guess let's start with some of the terminology you got there. This is a lot of the stuff that you guys do when you kind of do some 101 level stuff. We have a whole separate YouTube channel. We'll talk about that in a minute. But some of the football terminology, I'm guessing people know 3-4. That's something that if you've watched any football at all, you probably 4-3 is 4 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers. 3-4 is 3 defensive linemen, 4 linebackers. You will see different teams play different schemes. Ohio State has been a 4-3 team for a million years. Now that's maybe kind of changing a little bit under Jim Knowles. But I guess let's just sort of start with your thought on the jack position and how that might be a little bit different from what Georgia does, and why you think that might be beneficial for Ohio State.
Well, I think if you look at, like you talked about, the jack position, Ohio State right now, what you and Tony were talking about was, who's that guy really going to be? Larry Johnson says he wants to keep Jack Sawyer and all his defensive linemen at defensive line, and Jim Knowles says, no, I'm going to take a defensive end and teach him how to play linebacker. And really, it just seems like we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole right now with who's on the roster at Ohio State. And that's where I went to Georgia and used them as an example, obviously, because Ohio State played them in the bowl game in the playoff. They're able to bounce between the odd and even front, which is what Jim Knowles wants to be able to do, while maintaining the same base personnel, if you will, same 11 guys on the field, to kind of oversimplify it. So they're able to give you 3 down and 4 linebackers, or sometimes they'll do it before the snap. And I'm sure if you went back and watched the bowl game against Ohio State, you'd see them do it. They'll shift to a 4 down front, or vice versa. C.J. Stroud goes up, start the cadence, and they're in a 4 down front. Well, all of a sudden they'll shift to 3 down and take that defensive end, or what we're calling the jack linebacker for our discussion, and they'll walk him out, and all of a sudden turn the picture into a 3-4, which changes the blocking angles for the offensive line, or if it's a pass play, changes your protection and where the pressure could potentially be coming from. With what Jim Knowles does, is he does a little bit of that, but what we really saw with Jack Sawyer in particular is you would have this package where 33 would come in, and I think somewhere in my rant and ramble, I mentioned in there, they'd have 3 down, and Sawyer kind of looking like he's supposed to be a middle linebacker, not quite sure where he's supposed to go, and doesn't really look good doing it. Well, in his defense, he's a 5-star defensive end, not doing 5-star defensive end things. So you can't really fault the kid necessarily for struggling to become a middle linebacker his second year in college football, having never played it before, that I'm aware of at least, in high school or his freshman year at Ohio State. So that's a subtle difference between what Ohio State does and or what Jim Knowles wants to do, and what we see Georgia. Alabama, of course, does it as well, because they got the same defensive structure, and many other teams, both in the pro and college level, high school, you see it as well, where they'll take a tweener guy, or hybrid is the buzzword, defensive end linebacker that gives you the ability to go back and forth between 3 guys with their hand in the dirt and 4 guys with, turf these days, 4 guys with their hand in the turf.
So if you look at the Ohio State roster, you said, earlier that maybe there isn't a perfectly natural fit here because, if Jack Sawyer isn't the right fit there, I don't know, is Caden Curry the right fit there? Mitchell Melton seemed like he was kind of coming on really strong last year before he blew out his knee in the spring game. Could he be the right fit? Or is this more of a CJ Hicks or a Cody Simon or even a Sonny Styles? Is there someone in that group who you think is maybe most closely fits what you're looking for in that role?
I go back to, I'll go way back to Jim Haycock era at Ohio State, where they had a similar type position. And I believe they, ironically enough, called it the Leo, if I'm not mistaken. I've heard, over the years, I heard Leo and Viper, but it was guys like Thaddeus Gibson, I think, was really the first full-time guy to play that position. And then Nate Williams after him. And really, they were both guys that came into Ohio State as linebackers, hit the training table, got some meals in them, hit the weight room, and they went from, bigger linebackers into defensive ends that still had the ability to play in space. I think Thaddeus Gibson, one of his famous plays was that 3rd and line stop he had in the Rose Bowl against Oregon, where they dropped him in the middle of the field and he stops him short of the first down. So it's a linebacker who's turned more into defensive end because of the way his body's grown, but still has the ability to play in space adequately at that position. So on the roster, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite the recruiting guru necessarily, so I'm not quite sure where all these guys' bodies goes. But in terms of generically speaking, you want a linebacker type athleticism that maybe got a step slow for linebacker because he grew into a defensive end. I think a few years ago, I think they played around with that some with Sam Hubbard, if I'm not mistaken, because his body, he famously came in as a lacrosse player and, turned into a defensive end. So that type of body type that's started a linebacker, got bigger, potentially lost a step or lost a little bit of space ability, and he put his hand in the dirt, but still able to get out in space and play some and give you that flexibility.
Yeah, and as you're talking through that, a name that kind of jumped to mind for me was Gabe Powers, who was out of Marysville, Ohio. He came in as a linebacker, and just all through his recruiting process, he was someone who people were sort of divided on, was he going to outgrow linebacker and maybe be a defensive end? So maybe he's another name to sort of throw into the mix there. We have not talked to Gabe Powers yet this spring, and I don't think his name came up with James Laurinaitis, but maybe we can talk to them about that, and maybe that's a possibility as we head into spring ball in just a little over a week now. Holy smokes. So we've talked a little bit about now that role. I guess the natural question then becomes, what is this, you talked about the flexibility, so this maybe allows you to address everything a little bit better than a sort of one-size-fits-all. But is there a type of offense, a type of scheme, even if it's just, hey, this is better against the run, or hey, this would be better against the pass, is there something that this, your idea would maybe potentially be specifically good at addressing in terms of opposing offenses?
Well, this day and age, and actually, you go back when Jim Haycock talked about it, is you can't be a static front anymore. Meaning you can't give the same picture over and over again to an offense. Offenses are too good, and they'll exploit it. And you saw maybe guys like teams that are less talented, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but you saw, if you're going to line up recruiting ranking versus recruiting ranking on, say, Maryland versus Ohio State, well, there isn't a guy recruiting wise, I got tongue twisted there, who lines up offense for defense where the Ohio State defense should lose any of those matchups one-on-one. Well, when you're static and given the same picture all the time, you're able to exploit the weakness in each structure, and every defensive structure has weakness. Well, if you have a flex player, well, one, you can mask the weaknesses or change the picture to complement potentially your base front, force the offense to prepare for both fronts, change the picture, like I mentioned earlier, on the fly, like Georgia does, for example. I'll give you an example. I believe it was against TCU in the championship game. Georgia was in a 4-down front. TCU motioned, and I believe it was to an empty set. Georgia, without having to take a timeout or substitute or have a panic, they'd obviously prepared for it. They slid their front towards where the jack position was, walk that jack linebacker out over the what has now become the empty formation, and they're able to play drop 8 as their check to TCU's empty formation. So that's just a couple examples of how having that flex player up in the box is able to complement and give you more tools in your toolbox, if you will, defensively, than staying with the base true, I've got 4 defensive linemen structure that we've seen Ohio State running since at least Ryan Day's taken over.
So I guess sort of the $64,000 question in here is, so what about Larry Johnson? Because Larry Johnson has run essentially the same 4-down type, very traditional 4-down front for decades now. He came to Ohio State. He's been exceptionally successful with it over the years. And talking to him about the jack position and all that, he seems to want his defensive linemen to be defensive linemen and not necessarily have to worry about that stuff. So I guess the question to me is this something that really dramatically would change things for Larry Johnson? Does this change all sorts of technique stuff in terms of linemen? Does this change schematically things and how he has to teach things as a defensive line coach? What does this, if he is sort of resistant to make this type of change, and I'm sort of reading into some answers here, and he hasn't specifically said, no, I won't do that. It's just sort of, he doesn't seem to have maybe fully embraced it based on the way he's talked about it in the past. What kind of changes does that bring from his perspective that might be, something he has to adapt to?
Well, there's different ways to do it. You don't necessarily, and you've even seen the Bamas and the Georgias get away from some. Traditionally, when you think 3-4, you think 3 big, thick, huge Frankenstein creatures on the defensive line that are going to occupy 5 offensive linemen just by pure mass alone. Well, that style of game has gone away, and I think most famously is you go back to 2014 Sugar Bowl, and when Ohio State ran through Alabama, that really forced Nick Saban, and who was a defensive coordinator at that time, obviously Kirby Smart, and forced them to change their theory of defense. So as a result, they got smaller and faster, even at Georgia and Alabama. There's actually a really good clinic floating around the internet where Kirby Smart talks about how he changed his defense to get smaller and faster and compared his defense in 2009 to Alabama to 2019 at Georgia and how much smaller they've actually gotten. At the dates, I may have got screwed up a little bit, but the point remains the same. So as a result of getting smaller and faster, you can't ask your guys to necessarily just thick up and 2-gap all the time anymore. So, in this particular case with Larry Johnson, to get more to your question, you can still play with that jack linebacker position and shade your 3 down, much like he's used to teaching with the defensive linemen playing on edges. Now, you could potentially play them in a little bit heavier technique, which is where you're, going foot to, splitting the man in half with your inside foot instead of necessarily putting your inside foot on their shoulder pad and playing on the edge and playing in the gap. As a way to account for those gaps and way those cancel gaps. You can also cancel it by technique. Again, I'll go back and I keep referencing him, but Jim Haycock, when he went to the structure, he put his weak side defensive end, so opposite the jack, head up on the offensive tackle, and allowed him a 2-way go, meaning if the offensive tackle blocked out, the defensive end would actually come underneath and beat him with speed into the B gap to close that gap instead of necessarily brute forcing him and manhandling people. So there are ways to get it done technique-wise, and with Ohio State and the caliber of defensive linemen they got, and the ability they got, and the explosiveness they got, they're recruited to be playmakers. It would take a change in technique, potentially, instead of going a full-sale change to a true, hey, we're going to be 3 down, head up, get thick, be an old school 3-4. So you could definitely get it done. There's teams that do it. Again, I mentioned, Georgia, Alabama are easy examples, but I'm sure if you want to dig in and look at some other schools, you could find them where they're able to go between 3 and 4 down seamlessly without subbing personnel and without sacrificing who they got on the field.
All right, so hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I feel like that's something that is kind of an interesting, different sort of focus on this stuff, because Tony and I end up talking about a lot of this stuff, but we don't end up going super deep on the schematic stuff, just because that's not necessarily what our specific focus is. This is why we have Devin and Justin and Mikey and Ross. I mean, that's what these guys do. They are our scheme guys. They are our gurus. They are X's and O's guys who answer all these questions, talk about all this kind of stuff on the huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com. There's a whole thread specifically dedicated to this. So if you have questions, if you don't understand when he talks about the B gap, what is he talking about? Well, go in that thread and ask that question, and they will answer it, and they will make you a smarter football fan. And so if you guys are enjoyed this show, let us know in the comments. I want to know if you guys want to hear more of this stuff, because we have, like I said, we got lots of scheme guys. We can do lots more of this stuff if you want to hear more about it. I'm always happy to do that. And if you want to learn more about this also, make sure you check out our new YouTube channel. Obviously, you know about youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle. Hopefully you're subscribed there. We also have a new one that's going to be kind of ramping up a little bit now that we're in the off season, and that is at CFB Playbook. So if you at youtube.com/@CFB Playbook, I will put a link in the front page post on BuckeyeHuddle.com for this podcast straight to that channel. Go ahead and subscribe to that channel, because we are going to have our scheme guys putting up all sorts of stuff there. Mark Givler and Tyler Shoemaker, who you've heard on the show before, going to be doing a lot of sports gambling kind of stuff and analytics stuff in that channel. Lots of different content. Maybe a little different twist on what you're getting from us at Buckeye Huddle. Maybe a little more nationally focused at time, or more broadly focused on college football on the whole, on the scheme front. So you're going to want to be subscribed there. Again, it's a YouTube channel. It doesn't cost anything. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and you will get all that content delivered right to you at absolutely no cost, just making you a little bit of a smarter football fan right there on your phone or your computer. You can thank us later. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.